Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Welcome to another growing season of Oklahoma Gardening. Today, host Casey Hentges makes preparations for an exciting new demonstration garden. OSU Extension Turfgrass Specialist Justin Moss identifies some winter weeds in the lawn. Casey has tips for choosing when to plant which seeds. And we have a special guest that will help us take better care of our orchids.
With all the seed catalogs coming in that have such beautiful plant pictures and wonderful plant descriptions, whether you're new to gardening or well-versed, it's often tempting to try to find new plants to grow in your garden. And while buying seeds is a cheaper option, all those seed packets can add up pretty quickly and get expensive. And what guarantee do you have that those plants will work in your garden? One resource that might help you to narrow down your plant selection and also have more success in the garden is All America Selections. This is a nonprofit organization that does blind performance and taste tests on new varieties that are not yet available on the market. To ensure that they're truly new and improved varieties, they also grow them out alongside some of the market standards and some other plants that have very similar characteristics. They work with respected horticulturists across the country and have about over 80 trial gardens that they grow these out. In addition to the trial gardens, they also work with cities, universities, and public gardens to establish display gardens that showcase some of the previous AAS winners. As they say, tested nationally and proven locally. And we're excited here at the Botanical Garden at Oklahoma State University to be named as one of the new display gardens for AAS. Which means we're going to grow out a lot of these seeds and see how well they perform right here in Stillwater, Oklahoma. All of the gardens, both trials and display gardens, are divided up into regions. So in addition to the national AAS winners, there's also regional plant winners. We are in the Southwest region, or the Mountain region, which covers states from Oklahoma to Texas, up to Colorado, and as far west as California. And I suspect that some of these regional winners will do really well in our hot, dry climates. So as a display garden, we received over 52 varieties of seeds that we're going to grow out and plant in the garden. While a lot of them are vegetables, there are also a few ornamentals. While AAS doesn't directly market to the consumer, you might not be familiar with some of these newer varieties, but I guarantee you've probably heard of some of the older varieties, especially when it comes to tomatoes, such as the 1984 Celebrity variety, or the 1995 Big Beef, or perhaps the 1999 Juliet tomato. Again, you might not be familiar with some of these newer ones that we'll be showcasing, but we hope that you stick with us this season as we highlight how these plants do right here in Stillwater, Oklahoma. We want you to be successful in your garden this season, and this is one resource that might help you. For more information about the All America Selections seeds and where you can purchase them, visit their website.
So I wanted to show a few winter weeds that will pop up this time of year. You'll see growing out in the lawn, in the landscape. This one here is called shepherd's purse, and it's this tall one you see sticking up here. If you look at the bottom of this plant, it grows up from a base, a rosette is what they call it, and this stem will grow up from that base, and you can see these white flowers, a white cluster of flowers at the tip of the plant. And what's really interesting about it is you'll see these seed pods. So this is an annual winter broadleaf, and so it will germinate in the fall, grow through the fall and the winter, and then really set that seed in the spring so that it can reproduce and live another year. So it's a winter annual, and you'll see these heart-shaped leaf pods growing on the stem of the plant up near that white cluster of flowers. You'll notice that these are pretty tall, and at this time of year you're probably thinking about, well, what can I do to control some of these plants that come up like a winter annual like shepherd's purse? And so we really want to go scout out a little bit earlier in the season and find these and get them when they're young. When they grow up this tall and they're already flowering and they're already setting the seed, it may be a little bit too late to get any type of control through like a herbicide or anything like that. So what you can do is try to mow that off before that seed is set, and maybe pick up those seed pods through bagging it or other means, and just disposing of it. And that's a good way to get some control. But overall, if this is taking over your yard, this is probably going to resort to a herbicide application, maybe a pre-emergent in the fall, and then maybe a post-emergent broadleaf herbicide. Or even if the Bermuda grass lawn is dormant, you can use something that's non-selective like a glyphosate product if desired or if needed. They're also pretty to look at, and if you want to leave them there and let them set seed and come back the next year, you can do that as well. Most folks are probably going to want to look for control options though. Another winter annual broadleaf that we'll find at this time of year is henbit. And henbit is quite common throughout most of Oklahoma. You'll see it growing in a lot of yards in the January, February, March time frame. Especially start to notice it in that February to March time frame as these beautiful purple flowers start to poke out. Now this plant grows quite quickly through the winter time, especially with get some of these nice sunny warmer days in Oklahoma. It'll start to grow up and get quite thick and quite tall, and again becomes a little bit hard to control. If you look a little bit closer at it and maybe pick up one of the stems, what's neat about it is you notice you can actually count 4 sides to it. So it has this 4-sided stem, which helps us for ID. You'll see the leaves come out opposite, and then probably the best thing to look for is these purple or reddish flowers there at the end of the stem. So control is similar to other broadleaf winter annual weeds. So a product that's labeled for your Bermuda grass lawn, it's a broadleaf weed killer, is going to do quite well. Or if it's a dormant Bermuda grass lawn, you can use a non-selective herbicide such as glyphosate. What to be careful for is you want to hit these when they're small and they're young. Once they get very tall, like what we're looking at, this patch right here is more difficult to control. And this can take over almost an entire yard in Oklahoma in that February-March time frame. So again, maybe what you want to do is just keep it mowed down, come back the next fall, put down pre-emergent, and get whatever is left through that herbicide application in the January-February time frame when they're quite young. So here's one that's quite similar to henbit called purple dead nettle. In Oklahoma, we're probably going to see a lot of henbit out in the yard, but every once in a while we're going to run across purple dead nettle, which actually looks very similar. So sometimes the leaves of purple dead nettle will also kind of turn purplish or reddish. That's the name purple dead nettle. If you look at the stems, they can both look like a square stem. They both have opposite leaves, but often purple dead nettle will have some small petioles on the leaves where henbit will not. The leaves of the purple dead nettle have small ridges to them, but the leaves of the henbit have deeper lobes to them typically. The older leaves of the purple dead nettle, if I put them side by side here, you'll see that they almost have a spade shape to them, where the henbit leaves again are more deeply lobed, have that look to them. Maybe almost more confused with a Carolina geranium leaf, which is another similar winter annual broadleaf. So all these broadleaf weeds look very similar. We want to ID them, know if we have purple dead nettle or henbit, how to deal with them. Once they get too large, they're hard to control, so we're trying to hit these when they're young and early winter. If we wait too far into the spring, they're going to get pretty mature and be hard to control. And at that time, maybe just mow them down and keep it mowed down till the next season.
Whether you have some old seed that you're pulling out of the refrigerator, or perhaps you've bought new seed, you're probably starting to go through all those seed packets and figure out which ones you need to plant and when you need to plant them. Well, for a little general guideline, you might want to think about whether they're a warm season crop or a cool season crop. And one way to kind of determine that is to decide and figure out which part of the plant you're going to harvest. If you're after the fruit, which means the plant has to flower and then produce a fruit, such as tomatoes, peppers, and sweet corn, you're often looking at a warm season crop. If you're after another part of the plant, such as the leaves with kale and lettuce, perhaps the root with potatoes, radishes, and beets, or perhaps the flower, such as on broccoli and cauliflower, then you're probably looking at a cool season crop. Now, this is just a general guideline, as there are a couple of exceptions. With green peas, for example, that is a fruit, but it is a cool season crop. And with sweet potatoes, while it is a root that we're harvesting, it is a warm season crop. Okay, so what does all of this mean once we've determined whether we're planting a warm season or a cool season crop? Well, this is the ideal time that those plants thrive out in the garden. So if we're looking at a cool season crop, we know that they do better in early spring. And several of these crops can be directly sown into the garden, which means Mother Nature will take care of all of the work to germinate those seeds. Now, there are a couple of exceptions of cool season crops that do best from transplants, such as broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. And these are often the transplants that you start seeing in your nurseries early on with seed potatoes and onion sets. So you can buy them. But if you're wanting to grow your own broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower transplants, you want to start those about 5 to 6 weeks before you'll plant them out into the garden in mid-March. Now, if you're looking at warm season crops, there are several warm season crops that can again be directly sown out into the garden. But you're going to wait until the soil temperatures reach a consistent 50 degrees Fahrenheit at planting depth before you do that. Usually this is around mid-April. As I always say, you got to go pay your taxes before you can go play in the garden. Now, this is a general rule of the annual last freeze date in Oklahoma, and of course it can vary across the state, and you want to keep an eye on your forecast as that date approaches. But by directly sowing those warm season crops out into the garden, it does make them a little more susceptible if we do have any late freezes, because that plant is vulnerable to that. Several of the warm season crops that you can directly sow into the garden include okra, pumpkins, watermelon, southern peas, and sweet corn. Now, because Oklahoma has such a short-lived spring, there are a couple of warm season crops that you're going to plant as transplants out into the garden. A lot of times you can purchase those transplants either into late March or into April to put them out into the garden, or you can grow them yourself. So our warm season crops that we want to transplant are going to be the next seeds that we want to start thinking about getting them growing in our home or our greenhouse now. And these include tomatoes, peppers, and if you would like, summer squash. But summer squash can also be directly planted into the garden as well. And that's because tomatoes and peppers just need a little extra time to get established before we put them out in the garden. By planting these transplants, that just gives us a little extra time before the summer heat begins to crank up. Now, I know all this might sound a little complicated, so if you have certain seeds that you're really questioning about when to plant them and whether to directly sow them or to start them as transplants, always check the back of your seed pack and it'll tell you whether you need to start them early or to go ahead and directly sow those out into the garden. Also, for more information and a quick reference guide on when to start your seeds, and again, whether to start them out in the garden or ahead of time, check out this fact sheet. We're here with our local orchid expert, Dr. Doug Needham. And Dr. Needham, you were a former horticulture professor and really have a passion for orchids.
I do, absolutely. I love growing orchids.
So I wanted to kind of do the homeowner, I just bought an orchid at the grocery store. what do we do with it? Can you give me some tips?
Absolutely, and the one that you've brought is probably one of the most common that we see at garden centers and grocery stores and so forth. This is the Phalaenopsis, or the moth orchid. And it's really fairly well adapted to the home environment, and they're just extremely popular, and they stay in flower for months.
Yeah.
So it makes a great house plant. But how do you get it to last?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we grow it, we have it for the flower, and then we might pitch it.
Well, and certainly that's a choice, but let's hope that that you're
going to give us some tips
excited
so
about how do I grow this?
Yeah.
How do I make it flower again?
Right.
How do I keep it alive?
And now I know they usually come in the sleeve that we want to cut off.
That's right. You want to remove it from that.
And they always come with this care label. But
be careful of those care instructions.
Yes.
So what does it tell us to do?
So it tells us to water with 3 ice cubes once a week, which is equivalent to 1/4 of a cup of water. Place in bright, well-lit location, avoid direct sunlight, 60 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, never below 55, locate away from drafts, which is a good thing, to locate away from drafts. But ice cubes on a tropical plant?
No, do not put ice cubes on this plant.
Okay.
That's too cold. They don't want cold water. You want to use tempered water. So no, don't put ice cubes on this plant. If we want it to grow, we want it to thrive, we want it to be in our home for a long time.
So what about the 4th cup water? I mean, is that about for what the size is?
Rather than trying to limit it to quantity, the very best thing is to take this plant to the kitchen sink and literally flush it. So we're going to set the water here so that it's just cool, give it just a little more warmth, and literally then just flush that with water. And because the idea, notice how the roots are changing from white to green?
Oh, yeah.
That's that velamen layer soaking up the water. And you rinse, 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 rinse until those roots change from white to green. And then let all that excess water drip away. So, was that 1/4 cup? No, it was far more, wasn't it?
But you're letting it drain out.
You are, and that's the important thing, because it's flushing that, it's flushing any salts that have built up, fertilizer salts that may be building up in the media. It's helping to flush that through. Now all those roots have changed from white to green. They've soaked up that water so that they can transfer the water up into the plant.
And if we're doing this in a home situation with a water softener, could that salt be a problem too?
Definitely. So if you have a salt-based water softener in your home, do not use softened water on your plants, because that softener is replacing the calcium and magnesium, which is what makes water seem hard. It's replacing calcium and magnesium ions with sodium ions.
Okay, so go get some outdoor water.
Sodium is toxic to plants. Calcium and magnesium are secondary macronutrients.
Right.
They're essential for plants. So no, you want to use hard water, not softened water.
All right, so what else, where would we locate this in a house?
So that part of the recommendation was good. Brightly lighted area. It doesn't want to be in full sun.
How do I know when to repot it and when not to?
Excellent question. Because many orchids are epiphytes, air-loving, you're going to see roots coming out of the pot. That's perfectly fine. They don't need to be down in the pot. They're out in the air. They're getting moisture from the air, and when you water those roots. The key to look for is that the plant will no longer be in flower. It will have finished flowering. It will begin its growth phase, vegetative growth phase. So you'll likely see new leaf coming out of this growing point here at the tip, and you'll begin to see brand new roots coming through the base here of the stem. And so when you see those little roots pushing out, and when they're about a ½ inch long, that's the perfect time to repot your orchid, because then those roots are going to go right into that fresh medium. But there might be some that scamper over the top, and that's fine too. But you want to wait and only repot your orchid when it's in that active root phase.
All right, and how big of a pot should we go to the next time? I mean,
great question. Orchids do not like to be overpotted. And so this is a good sized plant or pot for this plant for probably another couple of years.
Oh, okay. So I don't need to do anything right away.
Well, but it would typically repot every year,
Oh.
because what happens is this bark that they're planted in, it will begin to get spongy. That's too far.
Oh, okay.
Because it starts holding too much moisture. And so it's really important typically to repot an orchid every year.
All right. Well, and you've got a couple of different medias that you use here.
Yeah.
What are we looking at?
So this is an orchid mix that's available at many stores, and it's a mixture of bark, and this is kind of some larger pieces of bark, and also you'll find some very coarse perlite in the mix, and then there's also little chunks of charcoal in the mix. So that's a good general mix. That would work very well for Cattleyas. I wouldn't typically use that for a Phalaenopsis, but you could.
Okay.
The Phalaenopsis, as you notice, doesn't have pseudobulbs.
Right.
So it doesn't have that water storage organ that a Cattleya has, for
Okay.
example. So it needs a little more moisture retentive mix. It still wants to be very well aerated, but a little more moisture retention. So I could take this and mix in a little long fiber sphagnum moss,
Okay.
because this will hold moisture. So I could actually mix those together. That
Could you
wouldn't be
just
bad.
use sphagnum moss? Or?
You could, and many growers do use pure long fiber sphagnum.
And this is dry, of course.
This
right
is
now,
dry,
yeah.
right? I just took it out of the bag. The key is that this is a long fiber premium sphagnum moss.
And
That's
you really
what you
want to
want
get that
for orchids.
hydrated, right?
Yeah, you do. You need to take this to the kitchen sink, water it, squeeze out all the moisture so that it's no longer dripping. So get it good and wet, and then squeeze out the moisture so that it's just damp.
Okay.
And now that's perfect for potting. I do want to make sure that it's clear that this is a long fiber sphagnum. It's not peat moss that you would buy at the garden center to incorporate into your garden soil, for
Okay.
example. Very different product. Another that's relatively new in the U.S. is a New Zealand bark, and this is from New Zealand pines, and it has a much longer life than the traditional bark-based mixes. And so this New Zealand bark, radiata bark, will last 2 or 3 years.
Oh, okay.
In the
So that
pot.
might work for my Phalaenopsis.
Yes, and would reduce then that need of repotting frequently, because you could go in this mix for probably, say, about 3 years before it would need repotting.
Okay. One last question
Mm-hmm.
about fertilizing then. What do we need to do and when do we need to fertilize it?
Well, I like to use the adage, fertilize weekly.
Okay.
And the two different spellings on that
Yes,
word, of
yeah.
course. So here in the greenhouse during the winter time, I fertilize with 50 parts per million nitrogen fertilizer. And so that's a relatively low rate of fertilizer, and I do that with every watering. And then about once every 2 weeks, I'll use a clear water to flush out any built-up salts.
Okay.
So the typical homeowner going to buy a package of fertilizer. It might say use a tablespoon per gallon, for example.
So it's usually a water soluble.
It's a water soluble. I would recommend that you use usually the little end of that is just a tiny amount. It may be a teaspoon or even less than a teaspoon.
Okay.
In that gallon of water. And so you use a very weak fertilizer solution, and you use that throughout the week.
Okay.
Every time it needs to be watered. And a Phalaenopsis typically is only going to need watering about once a week in the home.
Excellent. All right. And you'll do that throughout the season, whether it's blooming or not?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Needham, for telling us what we need to do in order to have a successful orchid.
Oh, my pleasure. You're most welcome.
There are lots of great horticultural events this time of year. Be sure and consider these activities when you're making your plans for the weeks ahead. Next week, Casey is back in the greenhouse growing transplants to put out in the garden. We dabble at making a dibble, and we begin a season-long look at a selection of plants that are proven for Oklahoma gardens. Be sure to join us then for more TV you'll grow to love. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanical Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We wish to thank our generous underwriters, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.